Good evening, friends. Before we dive into the tale, take a moment to breathe. Imagine a quiet mountain village, the kind where the wind whispers through the pine trees and the night carries the scent of smoke and stone. Tonight, I invite you to step into Solara, a village that rests on the edge of shadow and light, where every home holds stories older than the mountains themselves. But this is no ordinary story. It is about courage that doesn't roar, about responsibility that shines quietly, and about a boy who inherited more than a mere object. He inherited destiny itself. If you've ever felt small against the vastness of the world, or wondered what it truly means to hold light in your hands, this story is for you. And, as we journey together, feel free to imagine the lantern's glow brushing your own fingertips. Hold it close, because when he held it, the darkness stepped back. Let us begin. High among the jagged, windswept peaks, the village of Solara clung to the cliffs like a secret whispered to the mountains themselves. In the early morning, mist curled in soft, curling tendrils around the weathered stone cottages, drifting lazily across narrow paths that twisted between the sheer faces of the rock. Each cottage seemed suspended between earth and sky, their slate roofs slick with dew, lanterns dangling from eaves to cast their soft, trembling glow over the cobblestones. By dusk, when the sun dipped behind jagged peaks and painted the horizon with streaks of rose and gold, the lanterns were lit, and the village glowed with a gentle warmth, a defiance against the encroaching shadow of night. The villagers, shaped by the unyielding wind and treacherous trails, were a hardy folk, their hands roughened by labor and their eyes sharpened by vigilance. They knew every rock, every hidden path, every tree that had grown for centuries on the mountain's edge. Among them lived Kael, a boy not yet 12, but already familiar with the weight of responsibility that the mountains imposed. His hair, a rich chestnut, caught the sunlight in the mornings, and his eyes mirrored the shifting gray of the sky, sometimes storm-dark, sometimes silver-bright. Reflecting a mind that observed more than it spoke, his hands bore the roughness of constant toil, fetching water from the icy mountain streams that tumbled down in endless ribbons, stacking firewood until each pile was neat and balanced, and guiding the village goats along narrow ridges where one misstep could mean a plunge into the mist below. Yet despite the calluses, the small scars, and the enduring ache in his limbs, Kael's heart carried a quiet curiosity that set him apart from most children his age. He would linger at the edges of cliffs long after his chores were done, his gaze tracing the sun as it sank behind distant peaks, painting the sky with shades of violet, amber, and fiery crimson, a spectacle that seemed almost sacred in its fleeting beauty. Kael had always sensed that Solara was different, that it held secrets beyond what the ordinary eye could see. Even as a toddler, he had felt the hum of the mountains in his bones, the way the wind whispered through the pines with an almost intentional cadence, as if speaking to those who would listen. The elders often told tales of lanterns that were no ordinary lights, lanterns that would shine only in the hands of the chosen protectors, lights that could push back darkness both tangible and hidden, guardians of the village against threats seen and unseen. Kael had listened to these stories wide-eyed, enthralled, imagining what it might be like to hold such a lantern, to feel its warmth spread through his hands and illuminate more than just the village streets. Yet he never truly believed he would one day touch one, never imagined that the myths his grandmother murmured beside the fire were anything but bedtime tales. Even so, something in Kael's nature seemed attuned to the whispers of Solara. He noticed things others overlooked, the way shadows clung unnaturally to certain corners, the subtle shift in the wind when storm clouds gathered over hidden peaks, the almost imperceptible gleam on the cliffs that hinted at paths forgotten by time. He could sense patterns in the forested slopes and listen to the silence between the streams and the pines. The mountains seemed to watch him in return, to measure him against some invisible standard, and he felt a strange, unspoken bond forming with the rugged landscape that surrounded the village. The village itself was a patchwork of stone and wood, narrow paths winding between cottages like veins, carrying life through the heart of the mountains. Smoke rose in thin, curling columns from every chimney, mingling with the mist to form a soft haze that hung over the village at dawn. Children ran through the alleys with laughter that echoed against the cliffs, chasing each other with bare feet or small wooden toys. Livestock roamed freely, guided by shepherds whose voices carried easily in the thin air. Traders from distant valleys occasionally ventured along the treacherous passes to bring goods, dried herbs, woven cloth, and small trinkets, but they were rare, and most of Solara's needs were met by the ingenuity and endurance of its own people. Kael moved among them like a shadow, quietly observing, learning. He watched the blacksmith shape molten metal into tools and weapons, felt the heat of the forge on his cheeks, and marveled at the precision of each strike. He followed the healers into their small herb gardens, inhaling the sharp, pungent scent of dried leaves and roots, learning which plants could soothe pain or draw fever from a sick child. Every interaction, every fleeting moment, seemed to build a larger understanding in Kael, a sense that he was preparing, whether he knew it or not, for something greater than himself. At night, when the village lanterns flickered to life, Kael felt a strange pull toward the places where shadows gathered most densely. He wandered the stone paths, the lanterns in the windows casting dancing shapes across the walls, feeling the hum of energy that seemed to linger in the air. He would stop and listen to the wind as it bent through the pines, almost as if it carried voices, whispers of old guardians, echoes of times when lanterns had chosen their keepers and defended the village against threats no living person could recall. Sometimes, he would lie on the cool stone rooftops, staring at the stars as they appeared one by one, and wonder what lay beyond the mountains, beyond the forests, beyond the horizon he had never crossed. Kael's family had always been part of Solara's quiet lineage of protectors, though no one spoke of it openly. His grandfather, a stooped man with eyes like deep pools of memory, often regarded Kael with a knowing look, as though he could sense the potential in the boy's heart before Kael himself could. "The mountains choose who listens," his grandfather would say in a voice as soft as moss. "And the lantern chooses who is ready." Kael had always nodded politely, more out of respect than understanding, though deep down he longed to know what it truly meant to be ready. As the seasons passed, Kael became ever more attuned to the village's rhythms. He learned to notice the subtle signs that foretold storms or avalanches, the quiet hints that a path might be unsafe, or that the goats had wandered farther than usual. And with each discovery, each small moment of insight, he felt the growing weight of responsibility settle in his chest. Not as a burden, but as a gentle pulse, a rhythm that whispered, "You are ready. Soon, you will know why." One evening, as the sun dipped low and the mist rolled down the cliffs in thick blankets, Kael lingered at the edge of a particularly high ridge. The wind whipped his hair across his face, carrying with it the scent of pine, rain, and the distant, cold breath of the mountains. He looked down at the village below, lanterns flickering in every window, smoke curling lazily toward the sky, and he felt a strange swell of pride, of belonging. This was his home, his responsibility, and perhaps, he thought with a spark of wonder, his destiny. He had no way of knowing that the quiet curiosity that had brought him to cliff edges and hidden paths, the careful attention to the subtle movements of the world around him, was preparing him for something extraordinary, something that would demand not just courage, but steadfastness, patience, and the willingness to embrace a burden far greater than any boy should bear. And yet, as he inhaled the cold, thin air and let the wind tug at his cloak, Kael felt something he could not yet name, a light, faint but insistent, flickering in the depths of his imagination, hinting at the path he was destined to walk. The lanterns of Solara glowed steadily that night, each one a small beacon of warmth and defiance, and Kael, standing on the ridge with the mist curling around him, felt the stirrings of a destiny that would soon reach out and claim him. He had always known Solara was different. Now, without realizing it, he was ready to become part of its secret, to take a place in a lineage older than memory, and to carry the light that would hold back the darkness when it came. The festival of falling stars had arrived, and with it, the village of Solara seemed to awaken in a way that it never did during the quiet months of winter and early spring. That evening, the mountains themselves appeared to hold their breath, the air charged with a mixture of anticipation and enchantment. Lanterns swayed gently in the soft night breeze, their flickering lights bobbing like ethereal spirits floating among the stone cottages. The narrow alleys, usually silent except for the occasional bray of a goat or the scraping of a wooden cart, now reverberated with laughter, music, and the rhythmic clapping of villagers celebrating beneath the open sky. Smoke from small fire pits painted golden streaks against the darkness, curling in lazy spirals toward the heavens, mingling with the mist that rolled down the cliffs in soft, ghostly waves. Children ran with wide-eyed wonder, their hands clutching tiny lanterns of their own, chasing each other in circles and laughter, their voices echoing off the mountainsides, mingling with the whispers of the wind. Kael moved through the throng with a quiet awareness, his small frame easily slipping between villagers, his gaze drawn not to the fireworks or the dancing flames, but to the subtle patterns of light and shadow around him. He could see the way the lanterns swayed with the wind, casting long, wavering shapes across walls and paths. He noticed the way the smoke shifted, sometimes parting as though acknowledging a hidden presence, sometimes curling in unexpected directions as if guided by an unseen hand. His chestnut hair was ruffled by the cool evening breeze, and his gray eyes, often reflective of the mountain's moods, caught the glimmer of every flickering flame. Despite the excitement that pulsed through the village, Kael felt a quiet tension in the air, a sense that tonight was different, that the stars themselves were aligned to herald something significant. Kael's grandfather, a man of few words with a stooped back and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries, appeared from the edge of the crowd. His gait was slow, deliberate, but there was a certain urgency in the way he beckoned Kael forward, his hand raised just enough to signal the boy to follow. The villagers, engrossed in their own celebrations, hardly noticed the small figure slipping away, lanterns bobbing in the distance as Kael followed the old man along a winding path that led to the edge of the village. The cottage they approached was one Kael had always known, perched precariously near the cliff's edge, its stones darkened with age and soot from countless fires. It smelled of wood, smoke, and candle wax, carrying the comforting, familiar scent of home. And yet, as Kael stepped across its threshold, a subtle shift in the air hinted at the extraordinary awaiting him. The interior of the cottage was bathed in shadows, the light from the open doorway casting long, angular shapes across the walls. Shelves lined with relics of Solara's past. Ancient tools, weathered tomes, delicate carvings rose from floor to ceiling, each item whispering a story to anyone patient enough to listen. Dust motes floated in the slanting beams of light, catching in Kael's gaze like tiny stars fallen to rest. The old man moved with care toward a shadowed corner, his hand brushing against objects as if awakening them from sleep. Kael's heartbeat quickened, an unfamiliar mix of curiosity and reverence stirring deep within him. From the darkness, the old man produced a lantern unlike any Kael had ever seen. Its metal frame was intricate, etched with symbols and patterns that seemed to shift under the flickering candlelight, shapes that twisted and curved in ways that defied immediate understanding. The glass of the lantern shimmered with a gentle, internal glow, faint but steady, as if a contained star had been captured within its walls. Its light was neither harsh nor glaring. It felt alive, breathing softly, almost sentient in its presence. Kael reached out instinctively, drawn to it as if by some unseen force, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cool, smooth metal. "This lantern," his grandfather said in a voice hushed yet resonant, "has chosen our family for generations, and now it calls to you." Kael's hands closed around the lantern, and the moment his fingers touched the glass, a warmth spread through his palms and up his arms, settling in the center of his chest like a heartbeat that belonged not to him, but to the mountains themselves. The glow intensified, spilling across the cottage walls, pushing back the shadows that had lingered in corners, and along the shelves, the darkness seemed to recoil instinctively, as though acknowledging the lantern's master, and Kael felt an inexplicable surge of connection, not just to the object he held, but to something larger, something older, something eternal. The air in the room seemed to hum softly, a low vibration that resonated through his bones, through the floor beneath his feet, through the very stones of the cottage. He did not yet understand the full weight of responsibility that had been passed to him, nor did he comprehend the power that lay contained within the lantern. But even in that first moment, he felt it a quiet insistence, a rhythm like the pulse of the earth, like the heartbeat of Solara itself, calling him forward, asking him to rise to a role he had never imagined. It was not a voice he could hear, not in words, but in feeling, in the deep certainty that he was being watched, tested, and chosen all at once. The grandfather's gaze never left Kael, steady and unflinching, a mixture of pride and solemnity etched into his lined features. "The lantern does not call lightly," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "yet carrying the weight of ages, it chooses those who are willing to carry its light, who understand that with illumination comes responsibility, and that shadows will always test the strength of the chosen." Kael turned the lantern in his hands, marveling at the patterns of etched metal and the gentle, unwavering glow from within. He could feel a subtle warmth radiating not only from the lantern but from somewhere deep within himself, as if the object had recognized a part of him that even he had not fully acknowledged. His chest rose and fell with deliberate breaths, and for the first time, he felt the strange mixture of fear and exhilaration that accompanies the realization that life is about to change forever. Outside, the festival continued, laughter and music rising in waves that seeped through the walls of the cottage, but Kael no longer heard them in the same way. The glow of the lantern, the weight in his hands, and the quiet wisdom in his grandfather's gaze anchored him to a singular understanding. The world had shifted in that moment, and he could never return to the boy who wandered the cliffs, simply out of curiosity. He had been chosen, marked by light, and whatever came next would demand courage, patience, and resolve unlike anything he had yet encountered. The shadows in the corners seemed to shiver as if acknowledging the transfer of authority, while the warm glow of the lantern seemed to pulse in time with Kael's heartbeat, steady and deliberate. He realized that the lantern was more than an object. It was a guide, a protector, and a challenge all at once. It would not shield him from failure, nor would it fight the battles for him, but it would illuminate the path, revealing both the perils and the possibilities, and demanding that he rise to meet them with clarity and intent. Hours passed in quiet reverence as Kael and his grandfather sat together, the boy clutching the lantern and feeling the subtle energy that radiated from it. Stories of past protectors were shared in hushed tones, of moments when the light had saved lives, driven away darkness, or revealed hidden truths that no other eyes could see. Kael listened, enraptured, and though he did not yet fully comprehend the enormity of his task, he sensed that he had stepped into a lineage far greater than himself, one that had endured storms, shadowed nights, and threats unseen for generations. Finally, as the candles in the cottage flickered and the first hints of dawn brushed the horizon in pale gold, Kael placed the lantern upon a small stone table in the center of the room. Its glow remained gentle but insistent, like a promise of guidance. He looked up at his grandfather, who nodded solemnly, a quiet understanding passing between them. Kael felt the pulse again, deeper now, a rhythm that seemed to echo through every fiber of his being. He had not yet faced the trials that lay ahead. He had not yet encountered the shadows that would test the limits of his courage. He had not yet understood the full breadth of responsibility that came with holding such a light. But in that moment, with the warmth of the lantern cradled in his hands and the weight of generations pressing softly upon him, Kael understood something fundamental. He had been chosen, and in being chosen, he had become part of something eternal, something luminous, something that would define not only his life, but the fate of Solara itself. The festival of falling stars continued outside, but Kael's attention was elsewhere, focused inward and outward at once. Sensing the quiet hum of energy, the subtle shifts in the air, and the unspoken promise of a journey that was only just beginning, he would carry the lantern. He would honor its legacy, and slowly, steadily, he would learn what it truly meant to step into the light. The weeks that followed Kael's first encounter with the lantern were unlike any other in his life. The festival lights had faded into memory, leaving Solara as it always had been, silent, misty, and cloaked in the steady rhythm of the mountains. But for Kael, the world had shifted irrevocably. The lantern rested at the center of his waking thoughts and nightly dreams, its glow still vivid behind closed eyelids, and a subtle hum lingered in his chest, like the echo of a heartbeat that was no longer entirely his own. His grandfather became his guide, his teacher, and sometimes the quiet anchor that kept him grounded. The old man moved slowly, each step deliberate, carrying with him the weight of generations who had borne the same responsibility, and every evening, as the sun sank behind the jagged peaks, painting the village in shades of amber and rose, Kael would take the lantern in hand and follow his grandfather up the narrow, winding paths that led from the stone cottages to the cliffs above Solara. These paths were steep and treacherous, worn smooth by the passage of countless feet over decades. Yet they held a certain rhythm that Kael began to feel in his bones. The stones beneath his feet seemed to hum with recognition, a subtle vibration that guided him as the lantern's warm glow pushed back the gathering shadows. The first lessons were deceptively simple. "It is not merely light, Kael," his grandfather said, his voice low and steady. "It is a companion, a shield, and a guide. To hold it is to accept responsibility, not power. The world will not bend to your hands. You must learn to move with it, to sense what is hidden, to see what others cannot." Kael nodded, absorbing the words as he would the rhythm of a familiar song, though he did not yet fully understand their weight. Every night, the lantern revealed new truths about the mountains and the village. It illuminated crevices hidden beneath moss and lichen, paths worn by footsteps long since vanished, and corners where shadows seemed to linger with intent rather than passivity. Kael learned to notice the faintest shifts in the air, the almost imperceptible movements that hinted at unseen creatures or hidden dangers. Sometimes, fleeting shapes darted along the edges of the glow, indistinct and fleeting, shadows that seemed to observe him as much as he observed them. He learned not to flinch, not to panic, and slowly, steadily, he felt the first stirrings of a calm awareness, a quiet courage that was less the absence of fear and more the mastery of it. Courage, Kael, his grandfather reminded him one evening, the lantern swinging gently between them as they ascended a narrow ridge, is not loud, it does not roar, it is steady, it is patient. The lantern will not make you fearless, it will make you responsible. Remember that. Let the light guide you, but let your mind and heart choose your steps. Kael listened and nodded, his eyes reflecting the soft glow as they passed over jagged stones and the roots of ancient pines that clung stubbornly to cliff edges. He practiced, night after night, moving in harmony with the lantern's warmth. He learned to sense the pull of its energy, a subtle tug that seemed to respond not only to his movements but to his intentions. If he hesitated, if doubt crept into his heart, the glow would dim slightly, as though reminding him that his focus was as important as his courage. If he acted with clarity and care, the lantern brightened, painting the cliffs in hues of gold and amber, chasing away darkness as surely as a river carves a path through stone. It was during these quiet ascents, under the silver gaze of the moon, that Kael began to notice something extraordinary. The lantern responded to more than his hands. It responded to his heart. The warmth in his palms seemed to sync with the rhythm of his chest, and when he felt certainty, the light deepened and expanded, stretching across the cliffs in waves that danced over the rocks and the mist. When doubt gnawed at him, even in small, fleeting moments, the glow faltered, shrinking and dimming as if the lantern itself questioned his readiness. Kael spent hours perched on narrow ledges, studying the patterns of shadow and light, letting the lantern illuminate every nook and crack along the mountain paths. He discovered small animals that scuttled unseen, the hidden nests of birds tucked under overhangs, and the subtle movement of the wind as it carried scents and sounds from one part of the cliffs to another. Each night, he grew more attuned, not merely to the lantern, but to the world itself, the interplay of light and dark, of danger and safety, of certainty and hesitation. The old man, watching silently, sometimes spoke only a few words. "Do you see it now?" he asked once, gesturing at a deep crevice where shadows gathered unnaturally. Kael peered into the darkness, lantern light stretching across jagged stone, and noticed shapes shifting in the gloom. "It is never just absence of light," the grandfather continued. "Darkness is intent. It waits, it tests, and it moves in ways the untrained eye cannot see. The lantern reveals it, but only if you are willing to see it too." Kael shivered slightly, feeling a thrill that bordered on fear, but he did not pull back. Instead, he leaned closer, letting the lantern extend its warmth into the shadows. Probing with light and intention, he saw the faint glimmer of something metallic, half buried beneath stones, perhaps a fragment of a tool or a remnant of old protection charms. He touched it, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers, and the lantern pulsed softly, as though approving his discovery. That night, Kael realized that responsibility was not just about illumination, it was about understanding, perception, and the willingness to act even when the path was uncertain. As the nights progressed, Kael and his grandfather explored higher cliffs and deeper paths, places that villagers rarely ventured except for the most essential of chores. The lantern revealed the beauty of the mountain world that had always been hidden, delicate ferns clinging to sheer rock faces, streams that tumbled silently into shadowed ravines, and the silver sheen of moonlight bouncing off hidden waterfalls. Kael began to feel a kinship with the mountains, a sense that they recognized him as part of their enduring history, that they had been waiting for someone who could wield the light with reverence and care. It was not always easy. On some nights, the wind howled like a living creature, buffeting Kael and threatening to snatch the lantern from his grip. On others, he stumbled over jagged stones or misjudged a footing, feeling the pulse of panic rise in his chest. Each time, the lantern responded. Its glow seemed to steady him, to remind him that steadiness, patience, and careful thought were as powerful as courage. Kael learned to breathe in time with its warmth, to move deliberately, and to trust the subtle guidance it offered. He also discovered that the lantern reflected the nuances of his own character. When he acted impulsively or allowed frustration to take hold, the light flickered, throwing shadows that danced unnaturally. When he acted with humility, thoughtfulness, and courage, the glow deepened, reaching further and illuminating areas that had seemed impenetrable. Slowly, Kael understood that the lantern was not simply a tool, it was a living companion, responsive not to his wishes alone, but to the integrity of his actions and the steadiness of his heart. Some nights, Kael and his grandfather would sit on narrow ledges, legs dangling over the cliff, the lantern placed between them. The old man would tell stories of past guardians, of nights when light had saved lives or revealed dangers that no other senses could detect. Kael listened, absorbing every word, letting the lessons sink into him as he watched the glow stretch across the cliffs and the distant village below. The stories were not just history, they were guidance, a reminder that the lantern had always been a beacon for those who could wield it with care and intention. As Kael's skills grew, he began to notice subtler lessons. The lantern revealed not just physical danger, but emotional truths as well. A lingering shadow could be the result of fear, grief, or anger lingering in a place or person. He learned to recognize the difference between a threat and a remnant of past suffering. And he discovered that his role as lantern keeper was as much about understanding and empathy as it was about illumination. Each night, the lantern seemed to teach him more than his grandfather ever could, guiding him through darkness, both tangible and intangible, shaping him into someone who could see clearly when others could not. By the time the moon was high and silver across the village rooftops, Kael had grown into a quiet confidence. He no longer clutched the lantern in fear or awe. He moved with it as if it were an extension of himself, a living part of his being. Its glow, responsive to his heart as much as his hands, painted the cliffs in a steady wash of light, chasing shadows gently but persistently, illuminating paths for creatures, villagers, and even the boy himself. Kael realized that true courage was not about bravery in the face of fear alone. It was about patience, understanding, responsibility, and the willingness to illuminate the unknown, even when it was uncomfortable, dangerous, or uncertain. The lessons in light continued night after night, shaping Kael into a boy who understood the intricate dance between darkness and illumination. By the end of those weeks, he knew that holding the lantern was not simply a privilege, it was a covenant. The glow that emanated from it was not a gift to wield lightly, but a responsibility to carry, a companion to guide him, a mirror reflecting the steadiness of his own heart. And in that quiet mastery, Kael discovered a profound truth. The lantern did not merely shine, it taught, protected, and revealed, transforming the boy who held it into the guardian Solara would one day need. Not all of Solara's darkness was metaphorical. While the village itself rested beneath a cloak of mist and shadow each night, there was an eerie stillness to the air, an unsettling quiet that seemed to vibrate beneath the surface of everyday life. Over the weeks that followed Kael's acceptance of the lantern, strange occurrences began to ripple through the village, events that were not easily explained and whispered about in hushed voices behind closed doors. Cattle, usually well tended, and within the confines of the village pasture, began to wander mysteriously toward the cliffs. No one saw them leave, and no one could explain how they made their way so far from home, only to be found grazing near dangerous edges, their eyes wide and unsettled, their fur matted with brambles. The villagers spoke of it in passing, but the fear in their voices was palpable. Even the bravest of them could not ignore the chill that clung to the air each time they retrieved the animals. More than that, there were shadows that moved against the natural flow of the wind. The edges of the village would sometimes darken, as if an unseen hand had pulled the light from the edges of the day, leaving only silhouettes that seemed to writhe in places they should not be. It was as if the dark itself was alive, shifting, testing the boundaries of the light. Sometimes, villagers would claim to have heard strange noises, a rustling, a scrape against stone, the softest whisper that would pass by them like the wind but seemed too intentional to be the mere sound of nature. It was unsettling, and it made the air heavy with something more than just fog. One particular evening, after the wind had died down and the sky had darkened into an unsettling quiet, Kael felt the stirrings of unease. His grandfather had said nothing about the strange occurrences, but Kael could feel the weight of something unspoken in the old man's gaze whenever they passed each other. It wasn't fear that Kael saw, but a quiet tension that spoke of knowledge, of something hidden beneath the surface of the everyday. So, Kael did what he had come to do during these uncertain times. He climbed the northern ridge, lantern in hand, seeking to understand. The mountain paths were familiar by now, winding up through craggy rock faces and over steep ravines. The sharp scent of pine and cold stone filling his senses as he moved higher into the mountains. The lantern swung gently from his hand, its glow a steady pulse in the darkening evening. Kael felt its warmth, its reassurance, even as the wind picked up once more, stirring the trees and carrying with it the faintest whisper of voice, too soft to make out, but enough to make him pause. By the time he reached the northern ridge, the sky had darkened completely. A faint moon hung overhead, casting silver light over the land. But it seemed small, distant, unable to fully push back the thick veil of night. Kael moved toward the old ruins, their stone walls weathered and crumbling, remnants of something ancient and forgotten. He had been here many times before climbing the stones, exploring the overgrown corners where moss had claimed the ruins as its own, but tonight, something was different. A sense of being watched prickled at the back of his neck, and as he stepped closer to the stones, he saw them, shapes, dark and shifting, hiding in the shadowed crevices of the ruins. They were not quite human, not quite anything that Kael could fully recognize, but their movement was unmistakable. They were watching him. The wind carried their whispers. Soft, urgent, unintelligible, yet pressing against the edges of his mind like an echo in a cave. The words were not words, but the feeling of something trying to break through, a presence that was not meant to be. Kael's heart raced, the pulse of fear quickening in his chest, but the lantern's glow steadied him. The light within the lantern, which had always been warm and inviting, flickered briefly, as though responding to the tremors of his fear. It was almost as though the lantern was breathing with him, adjusting its brightness in tune with the rhythms of his heart. Kael stepped closer, his breath shallow, his mind fighting to push through the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. The shapes in the ruins recoiled as he moved, retreating from the light like shadows, trying to flee the touch of the sun. The wind seemed to quiet, the whispers fading, and in that moment, Kael understood something deeply. It was not a sudden revelation or a grand epiphany, but rather a quiet, certain truth that settled in his bones. The lantern was not simply a source of light, it was a protector, and now, Kael was its keeper. For the first time, Kael felt the true weight of his role. The lantern had chosen him, yes, but it also demanded something of him. It required courage, yes, but also discipline. It was not enough to simply carry the light, it was his responsibility to wield it, to stand firm against the darkness that encroached on Solara. The lantern was a barrier, but that barrier needed to be held. Sustained, Kael could not falter. Not now. The shapes in the ruins continued to shift in the dark, but they no longer moved toward him. The glow of the lantern seemed to keep them at bay, a barrier of light they could not cross, as if they understood the strength of the protection it offered. Kael stood firm, his grip on the lantern steadying with each breath he took. Slowly, cautiously, the shapes faded into the shadows from which they had emerged, leaving behind only the soft rustle of wind through the pines and the faintest tremor in the air. He did not know what those shapes were, or why they had appeared. He did not understand the full extent of the whispers or what they had meant. But Kael knew one thing for certain: something had changed. The shadows that had lingered around Solara were not just figments of imagination or the product of village superstition. They were real, they were active, and they were beginning to move. As Kael made his way back down the ridge, the weight of the lantern felt heavier than it had before. It wasn't an uncomfortable weight, but a steady reminder of the duty he had taken on. The path back to the village seemed longer than usual, as though the mountains themselves were reluctant to let him leave their watchful gaze. He passed through the trees, each step carrying him further from the ruins, but his mind was far from quiet. His grandfather had always spoken of the lantern's role in protecting Solara, but never had he mentioned the true nature of the threats it would face. Kael had expected nothing more than quiet nights spent guiding the villagers, lighting their way, but now he could feel it, feel the stirring of something ancient, something dangerous that had begun to wake. By the time Kael returned to the village, the first hints of dawn were breaking over the horizon, casting pale light across the rooftops. The lantern's glow had faded slightly, but it was still steady, still alive in his hands. He moved through the quiet streets, his steps measured, as though the weight of what he had experienced had slowed time itself. When he reached the threshold of his cottage, he found his grandfather waiting for him, standing in the doorway, his face grave, his posture solemn. Kael did not speak at first, unsure of how to explain what he had seen or felt. He had no words for the shapes, the whispers, the way the lantern had responded to his fear. He simply stood before the old man, the lantern still glowing softly between them, and waited. His grandfather looked at him for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the same steady, knowing gaze that Kael had seen in the lantern's light. The old man nodded once, his expression grave but not surprised. "The time is coming, Kael," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of something he had known for far longer than his grandson. "But choosing is only the first step. You must learn what it means to carry its light when the darkness does not retreat, when it presses closer, when it tests your resolve." Kael nodded, his throat tight, the realization settling over him like a mantle. The journey ahead would not be easy. The lantern would not shield him from all harm. It would only guide him, and he, in turn, would have to protect the village, protect the light, even when the darkness did not relent. The road ahead was uncertain, but Kael was no longer the boy who had first held the lantern in wonder. He was its keeper now, and the shadows were not done with him yet. Kael's life had always been a solitary one, shaped by the rugged mountains of Solara and the quiet, steady rhythm of daily chores. He had spent much of his time wandering the cliffs, exploring paths few dared to tread, and familiarizing himself with the mysteries that lay hidden in the folds of the land. Yet, Despite his growing understanding of the lantern and its power, Kael had never shared his journey with anyone. He had always assumed that responsibility, especially the weight of the lantern, was something one must carry alone. But all that changed when he met Leora. Leora was unlike anyone Kael had ever encountered. A spirited girl with wild, untamed hair, the color of storm clouds, she possessed a curiosity as sharp as Kael's own, tempered by a keen intelligence and a quiet boldness that set her apart from the other children in the village. She was always poking her nose into places others feared to go, her eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. If Kael was the silent observer, Leora was the questioner, the one who dared to ask why when everyone else was content to simply follow the rules. She was clever and fearless, often venturing into the forest alone, investigating the old ruins, or wandering into the unknown corners of the village's winding paths. It was on one such night, when the moon hung high above the village, casting its pale silver light across the darkened land, that Kael first encountered Leora in the north. He had been investigating the ridge again, the lantern glowing steadily in his hand as he climbed the familiar trail toward the ruins. The darkness seemed thicker that night, as though the shadows themselves were pushing in closer, testing the strength of the light. He moved with purpose, his senses heightened, aware of every creak of the wind and every shift in the landscape around him. As he approached the cliffs, he saw her Leora, crouched in the dirt among the rocks, her fingers tracing delicate patterns in the soil. For a moment, Kael hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt her or continue on his way. But curiosity won out, and he stepped forward, the soft crunch of gravel beneath his boots drawing her attention. She glanced up, her eyes sparkling in the dim light, and offered a quick, mischievous smile. "You're not afraid?" Kael asked, startled by the sight of her there alone. "It's so late. The darkness is thick tonight." Leora didn't flinch. Instead, she laughed softly, a sound that seemed to belong to the wind itself, light and free. "Afraid," she repeated, as though the idea was foreign to her, "of shadows. Not when there's light to guide us." She gestured toward the lantern in Kael's hand, its glow casting long shadows across the rocks. Her words lingered in the air, simple but profound, as if she had just unlocked a secret that Kael had not even realized he was keeping from himself. "Don't you ever get scared?" Kael asked. Still unsure, Leora's smile deepened, and for a moment her gaze seemed far away, as if she were looking past him into something he could not see. "What's to fear?" she said, her voice steady. "The shadows are nothing more than a reflection of the light, and where there's light, there's always a way forward." That night, for the first time in a long while, Kael felt a sense of companionship. There was something in Leora's presence that softened the sharp edges of the world, a calmness in her belief that the light could indeed chase away the dark. And so, from that moment on, Kael found himself seeking her out. The two became companions on their nightly journeys through the cliffs and forests, discovering things together that neither could have found alone. Leora had a remarkable mind, one that was both logical and intuitive. She noticed things Kael missed, the way the wind shifted through the trees, the subtle patterns in the flow of streams, the way the stones beneath their feet seemed to whisper of ancient paths and forgotten places. With the lantern in hand, they uncovered secrets that had been hidden for centuries. And Kael quickly realized that Leora's ability to read the land, its quiet language, was an invaluable skill. Together, they uncovered old carvings on the cliffs that had been worn away by time, fragments of a language lost to the village, their meanings buried in the soft stone. They found hidden caves deep in the mountains, long forgotten by the villagers, their walls lined with strange markings that Kael could not understand. But Leora seemed to intuitively recognize. Every corner of the land held a mystery, and with each discovery, Kael felt the weight of his responsibility as lantern-bearer deepen. There was a particular night that stood out to Kael, one when they discovered a hidden pathway that wound its way through the thickest part of the forest, a place the villagers rarely visited. As they followed the path, illuminated by the lantern's glow, Kael felt an unspoken bond between them growing. The darkness around them seemed less threatening with Leora by his side. She wasn't just a friend, she was a counterpart, a partner in the unspoken dance of light and shadow. They made each other braver, more confident. Where Kael was methodical and careful, Leora was impulsive and daring, often charging ahead with little thought to the consequences. But her sharp mind and intuition always led them safely through. Yet, despite the warmth of their friendship, something inside Kael remained unsettled. The lantern, as much as it had become a part of him, was not something he could share. The responsibility it carried was his alone. It did not respond to anyone else's touch. Kael could feel it in the way the lantern's glow softened when Leora came too close, as if it recognized the difference between them. He could not help but wonder whether she truly understood the burden he carried. One night, after a particularly long trek through the forest, the two of them sat atop a high ridge, overlooking the village below. The lights from the village flickered like tiny stars in the distance, but here on the ridge, with the wind tugging at their clothes, there was only the quiet company of the moon and the lantern. Kael had been quiet for some time, his thoughts tangled in the heavy silence between them. "What is it?" Leora asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. She had always been good at reading him, knowing when something was troubling him without him having to say it. Kael hesitated. "I'm not sure you understand," he began slowly, his voice uncertain. "The lantern, it's not just a light. It's a responsibility, and I can't." He trailed off, unsure how to put his feelings into words. "I can't share it with you. Not the way I share everything else." Leora turned to him then, her eyes reflecting the glow of the lantern, her expression serious but not unkind. She was silent for a long while, and Kael could feel the weight of her gaze, as though she were thinking through everything he had just said. "You think I don't understand?" she asked at last, her voice quiet. "I don't need to carry it to understand what it means. But you don't need to carry it alone, Kael." She smiled then, a faint, knowing smile that caught Kael off guard. "The light's not going anywhere, is it? It'll always be with you." Her words settled over him like a blanket, soft and warm. It wasn't about sharing the lantern or the burden. It was about walking beside him, helping him find his way when the darkness seemed too thick to push through alone. And yet, despite the comfort her words gave him, Kael knew the truth that hung between them. The lantern responded only to him. The bond between him and the light was one that could not be shared, no matter how deep their friendship grew. The lantern's power lay in his hands, and only his hands. It was a truth Kael would have to come to terms with, no matter how much it ached. As the days passed, Kael's bond with Leora only deepened. Together, they uncovered more secrets of the land, hidden paths, forgotten caves, and ancient inscriptions that seemed to echo with forgotten promises. But as their friendship flourished, the darkness also grew stronger. Kael could feel it, felt its restless, creeping presence at the edges of his awareness. The lantern's light, though bright and steady, could not hold back the shadows forever. And soon, those shadows would begin to press in on him, testing him in ways he had not yet prepared for. The true test was coming. And this time, the lantern would not be enough to protect them all. The storm came as a sudden fury, a wild and unrelenting tempest that swept across the mountains with little warning. The villagers of Solara had grown accustomed to heavy rains, to the occasional rumble of thunder echoing through the peaks, but this was something different. The sky darkened in an instant, clouds swirling in unnatural patterns, and the wind howled like an ancient spirit, rattling the windows of every home. By late afternoon, the first drops of rain fell with a vengeance, quickly turning into a torrential downpour that flooded the narrow paths and slicked the stones with mud. Kael stood at the threshold of his cottage, his hand clutching the lantern as the wind buffeted the door, the sound of the storm almost deafening. His grandfather had already gone to check on the village's perimeter, as he always did when the storms hit, but Kael could feel the air vibrating with tension. Something was wrong. The storm was too fierce, too sudden. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and they were telling him that the mountain was about to shift. The first sign of trouble came as a deep rumble, low and menacing. The ground beneath Kael's feet trembled, and he felt the world shift, the earth groaning in a way that was almost alive. Before he could react, the sound of rocks shifting and tumbling down the mountain filled the air, followed by the terrifying crash of a landslide that ripped through the mountainside, blocking the main trail that led into Solara. Panic spread like wildfire. The villagers, already uneasy under the growing intensity of the storm, rushed toward the blocked path, shouting in fear and confusion. The landslide had struck fast, and it was clear that no one could pass through. Families were stranded, trapped behind walls of dirt and rock, unable to reach safety or return to their homes. The storm raged on, unrelenting, as the sky seemed to open up completely. Kael knew what he had to do. He had known, in some quiet part of himself, that this moment would come. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. The lantern chooses, but you must be the one to carry it. This was the test. This was the moment he had been preparing for, though he had never imagined it would come so suddenly, so violently. Without a second thought, Kael grabbed the lantern from the table, its glow steady despite the storm's fury. His hands were calm as he gripped it, feeling the warmth of the light spill over his fingers, steadying him in the chaos. The lantern had always been a source of comfort, but tonight, it was more than that. It was a lifeline. He found Leora just outside the village, her eyes wide with concern. She had seen the landslide, too, and her usual boldness had been replaced with something else, a quiet understanding of the danger they faced. We need to get everyone to safety, Kael said, his voice firm despite the fear that gnawed at him. Leora nodded without hesitation, her eyes meeting his with the silent agreement that had always existed between them. Where do we go? Kael's gaze swept over the debris-filled path. It was clear that the main trail was impassable, but he had been to the village's edge enough times to know of a hidden route, one that wound around the mountain and down into a sheltered valley where the storm's force was not as overwhelming. He had discovered it on his own many months ago, during a quiet evening walk, and had often wondered if it might one day become important. Follow me, Kael said, and with the lantern held high, they set off. The hidden path was narrow, winding its way through thick underbrush and dense trees. The storm made it treacherous. Mud and water slickened the trail, and branches whipped at their faces as they pushed forward. Every step was a struggle, every inch of ground hard-won. As the storm's fury intensified, the wind howled like a living thing, tugging at their clothes and the lantern's light. But the glow remained steady, cutting through the darkness like a beacon in the night. Kael felt its pull, its constant reassurance, like a breath he could rely on. The rain lashed against them, and Kael could feel the cold creeping into his bones. His heart raced with the knowledge that every moment was critical, that there was no time to waste. Behind him, he could hear the frightened whispers of the villagers, their voices trembling in the storm. He turned back briefly to glance at them, seeing the fear in their eyes, their faces washed in the harsh light of the lantern. The weight of their trust settled on his shoulders like an iron mantle, but he did not waver. "Stay close," Kael shouted. Though his voice was barely audible over the storm, he led them around a bend, his heart pounding in his chest. Leora moved quickly beside him, her movements graceful even in the midst of the chaos. She had always been the more agile of the two, her quick thinking often saving them both in the most difficult of situations. As they moved deeper into the forest, Kael could feel the presence of the lantern growing stronger. The light had always been a guide, but tonight it was more a shield that held back the darkness, both literal and metaphorical. It was a reminder of everything that Kael had come to learn. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the quiet, steady force that carried you through it. The path became steeper, and the ground beneath them shifted with every step. Rocks tumbled down from above, and Kael could hear the distant rumble of more landslides in the distance. The storm had triggered something deep within the earth, something Kael couldn't fully understand, but that didn't matter now. He had to keep moving. As they neared the valley, the path became even more treacherous. The wind tore at them, branches snapping and the rain pouring in torrents. Kael could hear the sound of water rushing beneath them. Streams had turned to raging rivers in an instant. The mountain's natural forces overwhelming everything in their path. The lantern's light was a steady presence in the chaos, cutting through the rain and darkness, guiding them forward. By dawn, they had made it. Everyone was safe. The exhausted villagers huddled together in the sheltered valley, their faces pale from fear but relieved to be out of harm's way. Kael stood at the edge of the group, his heart still pounding, his body drenched in rain and mud. His hands, though tired, still clutched the lantern, its light steady despite the storm that had raged through the night. Leora came to his side, her face streaked with mud, but her eyes bright with admiration. "We did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Kael didn't speak at first. His mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The storm, the landslide, the fear, everything had come crashing down on them so quickly. And yet, they had made it through. He had carried the lantern, guided the villagers, and kept them safe. It had been a test, and he had passed it. But at what cost? The weight of responsibility still sat heavily in his chest, a constant reminder that this was only the beginning. The villagers, huddled together in the valley, began to murmur among themselves. Kael could hear their words, soft and reverent. As they looked toward him, "The boy," one of them whispered. "He led us through the storm." Another voice joined in, stronger now. "He's the one with the lantern." Kael felt his face flush, but he didn't know what to say. The lantern had been his guide, yes, but it was more than that. It had been a part of him, a steady force that had kept him moving, even when the world around him seemed to be crumbling. For a moment, he thought they might approach him, might thank him for what he had done. His gaze fell to the lantern in his hands, and the weight of it seemed to remind him that his task was far from over. He had passed the first test, yes, but there were many more ahead, and the darkness that had stirred in the mountain was still out there, waiting. "Courage is quiet," his grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "Steady, patient, and sometimes invisible." Kael nodded to himself, his heart still racing, The village was safe for now, but the lantern had shown him that the true test had only just begun, and it would be up to him to face whatever came next. Determined to understand the lantern, Kael returned to the ruins with Leora. The ancient carvings on the stone, long faded, suddenly glowed faintly in the lantern's light. Symbols told a story of guardians, chosen to protect the village across generations. The lantern was more than a light, it was a key. It could reveal hidden paths, warn of danger, and even repel malevolent forces. And yet, with each revelation came a chilling realization. The lantern had limits. Kael could not fight the darkness alone forever. That night, as they left the ruins, the stranger appeared again. This time, he extended a hand not threateningly, but with caution. "You have the gift," he said, voice low. "But gifts can be stolen, and darkness is patient. Learn quickly, or Solara may not survive." The following weeks brought an ominous quiet. Cattle vanished. Strange sounds echoed through the cliffs, and the villagers reported glimpses of shapes with glowing eyes. Fear spread, but Kael and Leora refused to let panic rule. One night, they climbed the ridge to investigate. A pack of shadowy figures emerged from the mist, circling silently, testing the lantern's light. Kael's hands trembled, but he held firm. The glow flared, sending the shadows recoiling, hissing like wind through dry leaves. It was their first confrontation. The lantern did not destroy the shadows, it held them at bay, buying precious time. Kael realized courage alone was not enough. Strategy, trust, and careful observation would be their weapons. Kael returned to his grandfather's cottage, lantern in hand, seeking guidance. The old man revealed the lantern's deepest secret. It was linked to the soul of Solara itself, a living beacon born from centuries of guardianship. "To wield it," he said, "you must give part of yourself, not fear, not strength, but your resolve. Only then will its light become unbreakable." Kael understood. Holding the lantern was not merely a task, it was a covenant. And when he faced the darkness again, he would do so not as a boy, but as a protector of Solara. The shadows attacked on the night of the winter solstice, a time when Solara's mountains were cloaked in snow and ice. The villagers huddled inside, the wind screaming against their doors. Kael and Leora led a small group to confront the darkness. The lantern blazed in Kael's hands, its glow pushing the shadows back, illuminating every crevice where danger lurked. The stranger joined them, not an enemy, but an ally. Together, they discovered that the shadows were drawn from forgotten grief and anger, remnants of old wrongs the village had buried. Kael raised the lantern high, letting its full light shine across the mountains. The shadows wailed, then dissolved into mist. Silence fell. Solara had survived, and Kael had learned the truest lesson of all: courage is quiet. Responsibility is steady, and light, once embraced fully, cannot be extinguished. A week had passed since the storm, and Solara, once again, found itself cloaked in a false sense of peace. The villagers went about their daily lives, restoring what had been lost in the wake of the landslide. The storm's fury had left scars in the land, but the village itself had endured. The earth had shifted, the path had been cleared, and the lantern's light had guided them to safety. Still, Kael felt the weight of something unspoken hanging over the village, a presence that was not quite tangible but very much real. It was during the evening, as dusk settled over the mountains and the air became thick with the scent of pine and rain, that the stranger arrived. He appeared without warning, slipping through the village's narrow streets like a shadow blending into the twilight. Cloaked in dark fabric that billowed around him like a living thing, his face was obscured by the hood of his cloak, but his eyes sharp, piercing, seemed to cut through the dusk as if they could see beyond the physical world. The moment Kael laid eyes on him, an unsettling feeling crawled up his spine. There was something about the stranger that felt wrong. The man spoke little, but when he did, his voice was low, as though carrying secrets from places that had not seen light for centuries. His words had a quiet weight, a gravity that made the air feel heavier around him. He watched Kael closely, his gaze focused on the lantern that Kael still carried, as though it were not just an object, but an extension of something far more important, something that had drawn him here. "You carry something powerful," the stranger said one evening, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind. Kael felt his pulse quicken as the words hung in the air between them. "More than you understand. Be wary of those who desire it for themselves." Kael's heart raced, and for the first time since accepting the lantern, he felt the sharp sting of fear. It wasn't just the stranger's words that unsettled him, it was the way the man looked at him, as if he could see straight through to Kael's very soul, as if he knew exactly what the lantern was and what it meant. The stranger didn't wait for a response. He turned, vanishing into the shadows of the village, his footsteps soft but deliberate, as though he had no need for anyone to follow him. The night swallowed him up, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Kael stood frozen, his hand tightening around the lantern, its light flickering just slightly, as though in response to the strange encounter. Leora had been standing nearby, her brow furrowed as she watched the interaction. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Kael shook his head, still unsettled by the encounter. "I don't know, but there's something about him that doesn't feel right." The next few days passed in a haze of unease. Kael couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger had not just appeared by chance. He seemed to linger at the edges of the village, always watching from afar, his dark silhouette standing at the edges of the tree line, his presence always just out of reach. Sometimes, Kael would catch a fleeting glimpse of the man as he passed through the shadows, but by the time Kael tried to approach, the stranger was already gone, slipping into the darkness as though he were part of it. The villagers noticed his presence too. At first, they whispered among themselves, unsure whether he was friend or foe. Some believed he was merely a wanderer, passing through as so many others had before him. Others, however, were not so sure. Kael could sense the growing unease that rippled through the village, an unspoken tension in the air that made people glance nervously over their shoulders, their conversations halting whenever the stranger was near. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the mountains and the sky had turned deep purple, Kael and Leora ventured out to investigate. They had become more attuned to the stranger's strange behavior, his sudden appearances and disappearances, the way he seemed to slip in and out of sight, always leaving behind an unsettling silence in his wake. "We need to find out more about him," Leora said, her tone serious as they walked through the village's narrow streets. "There's something off about the way he's been watching you, I know." Kael replied, his voice low. "But what do we do? He's always gone before we can even speak to him." Leora glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Maybe we don't wait. Maybe we follow him." Kael hesitated. The idea of chasing after the stranger sent a chill through him, but Leora's determination made him pause. Together, they moved quietly through the village, their footsteps barely audible on the cobblestone streets. They kept their distance, allowing the stranger to remain unaware of their presence. As they approached the outskirts of the village, where the forest began to reclaim the land, Kael felt the familiar, unsettling pull of the lantern in his hands. It was as though the light responded to the danger, pulsing faintly in his grip, as if warning him of something lurking just beyond the reach of the trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the wind carried whispers soft, unintelligible sounds that seemed to echo off the trees. Her gaze darting nervously around them. Kael nodded, his heart racing. There it was again, soft whispers, too faint to make out, but there, nonetheless. It was as though the very wind carried the voice of something that didn't belong here. They continued forward, each step bringing them closer to the trees, to the edge of the forest where the stranger had been seen. And then they saw him. The stranger stood near the edge of the woods, his back to them, his figure barely visible in the growing darkness. Kael could feel the weight of his gaze, even though the man didn't turn around. Leora took a hesitant step forward, but Kael gripped her arm, stopping her. "We need to be careful. He's more than he seems." But as if he had sensed their presence, the stranger spoke, his voice low and smooth, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You shouldn't have come." Kael's breath caught in his throat. The stranger turned slowly, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural intensity, his cloak rippling in the wind like something alive. He took a step toward them, his gaze fixed on Kael, piercing and unblinking. "You're the one," the stranger said softly, his voice carrying a strange weight. "You carry the lantern. You think you understand it, but you know nothing." Kael felt a chill settle in his bones, the lantern pulsing slightly in his hands, as though reacting to the stranger's words. His grip tightened on the lantern, and for the first time, he understood what his grandfather had meant when he spoke of the trials that would come. This wasn't just some passing threat. The darkness that Kael had sensed was real, and it was closer than he had ever imagined. "You don't belong here," Kael said, his voice steadier than he felt. The stranger's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll soon learn. The lantern doesn't just guide, it also calls, and there are those who would kill for what you carry." With that, the stranger turned and disappeared into the forest, vanishing as suddenly as he had appeared. Kael and Leora stood in stunned silence, the weight of his words settling heavily in the air between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind had picked up again, and the whispers had faded, leaving only the crackle of distant thunder. Kael's heart still raced, and the lantern felt hotter in his hands, pulsing with an urgency he had never felt before. "That was no ordinary traveler," Leora said finally, breaking the silence. Kael nodded, his mind racing. "He knows about the lantern, he knows what it can do, and that means something worse is coming," Leora said softly. "He's right. The lantern doesn't just guide, it calls." Kael's heart dropped as the realization hit him. The quiet trials had ended. The darkness was no longer just a shadow, it was a force, and it was coming for the lantern, and for him. As the sun rose, painting the mountains gold and rose, Kael returned the lantern to the village square. Villagers gathered, eyes wide with gratitude and wonder. Leora beamed, knowing they had both grown through trials they could not have imagined. Kael lifted the lantern one last time, its glow soft and steady. "The lantern shines," he said quietly. "Not for me alone, but for all of us. And I promise to carry it, to guide us through darkness, as long as I am able." The villagers cheered, and Kael felt a warmth not from the lantern, but from their trust. He had stepped into a legacy, not by desire for glory, but by embracing responsibility. And now, friends, as we leave Solara, remember this. Sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest light. Sometimes courage is quiet, and sometimes the lanterns we hold illuminate more than the night they illuminate ourselves. If you enjoyed Kael's journey, be sure to like this video, leave a comment sharing your favorite moment, and subscribe to join us for the next tale. Every story is a light waiting to be discovered, and together we'll explore them all.